close your eyes. Not because the night is asking anything of you. Not because there is a state you are supposed to arrive at before this is over. Just because the day has finally run its course. And the body has been waiting for exactly this permission, longer than the mind has been willing to acknowledge. Let the weight come down. All of it. The thing that did not resolve the way you needed it to. The conversation still turning somewhere in you. Looking for the version of itself that ends differently. The small accumulations that do not announce themselves as heavy but that add up. Over the hours of an ordinary day. Into something that settles in the chest and the shoulders and the space behind the eyes and simply stays. None of it needs to be finished before morning. Right now, there is only this room, this quiet, the sound of your own breathing, which has been doing its work faithfully through every hour of this day, without once asking for your attention. Something is worth holding tonight, before sleep comes. Not a doctrine, not an argument, just a night. One specific night. In a city, still rising from the longest kind of loss. Among a people who had come back to find that the center of everything they had built their life around was no longer standing. On the 24th day of the 11th month, in the second year of the reign of Darius of Persia, a prophet named Zechariah received 8 visions in a single night, each one arriving with its own strangeness, and a messenger standing inside it, whose purpose was to explain what the eye was seeing before the mind had found a way to hold it. Tonight you are going to move through all 8. Let your breathing go slower now. The first vision is just ahead, and it begins with a man standing very still in the dark, among trees, with news that no one expected to receive as grief. Most people who grew up with the Bible carry it the way you carry a city you have lived in long enough to stop seeing it clearly. You know the main roads without thinking. You know which streets feel like which quality of light in different seasons, and which ones lead where without having to look up. The landmarks are no longer landmarks. They are just the places you pass on the way to other places. And over the years, the familiarity that began as genuine understanding has quietly become something else. Something closer to the assumption that you already know what is there, which is a different thing from actually looking. In that city, most people know where the major buildings are. Genesis and the Psalms. Isaiah, with its long, sweeping visions. The Gospels and the letters of Paul. Revelation, with its strange, consuming imagery. These places have been visited enough times that the roads to them are worn into memory, and the visiting has become nearly automatic. Zechariah is one of the streets most people have driven past without stopping. The name is familiar. A verse or two may have surfaced at some point. Usually in an Advent reading or a Good Friday liturgy. Separated from its context by the habit communities have of carrying the most usable fragments of a text forward while leaving the rest behind. Enough to recognize the name, not enough to know the night. The 24th day of the 11th month, the month of Shebat, in the second year of Darius, king of Persia. Scholars who work on the chronology of this period generally place this date at around the 15th of February in the year 519 before the Common Era. Late winter in the highlands around Jerusalem, the particular cold that arrives after sundown and settles into the stone in the ground and does not lift until the sun has been arguing with it for a full hour. On that night, in that cold, a prophet received 8 visions, and if you want to understand why those visions carry the weight they carry, you have to know something about the world that received them. Because the 8 visions did not arrive into a neutral situation. They arrived into a specific and layered grief, the kind that accumulates over decades and that does not announce itself in a single moment, but rather settles gradually into a community until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. The grief of having come back to a place that was no longer the place you remembered leaving. Babylon had been the dominant imperial power in the region for generations. It was under Babylonian rule that Jerusalem had been destroyed. More than 6 decades before the night of the 24th of Shebat. The destruction had not been partial. The walls that defined the city's boundary had been broken at enough points that the boundary no longer functioned. The houses had been emptied or occupied by others who moved into the vacuum of the long absence. And the temple, the building that stood at the center of Jewish religious life in a way that is difficult to overstate, had been brought down to its foundations. The rock was still there. The outline of what had stood was still traceable in the ground, but nothing rose above it. The Babylonian Empire itself did not last. Cyrus of Persia conquered it, and one of his first decisions as ruler of the region was to issue a decree permitting the exiled Jewish community to return to their homeland. The people who had been carried away had maintained themselves across more than 2 generations in a foreign land, keeping their traditions and their identity under conditions that might reasonably have dissolved both. The decree opened the possibility of return. Many of them went back. What they found when they arrived was not what the imagination had built in the years of absence. The city was not waiting. Jerusalem had not held its shape in their absence, ready to receive them. The walls were broken, the houses were empty or taken, and the temple was gone, not damaged. Gone. The foundations were there, in the rock. But the structure that had made this city what it was no longer stood above the earth. This is the world Zechariah entered as a prophet. The text gives us his lineage. Son of Berechiah, son of Iddo, placing him in a priestly family and giving him a particular kind of standing in the community he would speak to. One way of reading a phrase in the 2nd chapter of his book suggests he was young at the time of his ministry. Though scholars continue to discuss what the phrase points to, and no single reading has settled the question, what the text leaves you with, regardless of how that detail is resolved, is a strong impression of someone still learning the full scale of what was being placed in his hands. Someone young enough to be surprised by what arrived, old enough to understand what it meant to be asked to carry it. He arrived 2 months after Haggai had already begun. Haggai and Zechariah were working in the same city, among the same returned community, with the same central urgency. The temple needed to be rebuilt. The work had begun under Zerubbabel, the governor appointed by Persia, and Joshua, the high priest, but the work had stalled, and Haggai had spent his ministry addressing that stalling with the directness of someone who had looked at the situation clearly and saw no reason to approach it gently. Is it time for you to live in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? He connected the community's practical difficulties, the disappointing harvests and the wages that seemed to evaporate without accounting for themselves, directly to the failure to rebuild. He named the gap between what the community was doing and what it needed to be doing. He spoke in the language of cause and effect, of practical consequence, of action and its absence. The people responded. The text records it with a specificity that suggests it really happened this cleanly. Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua the high priest, and all the remnant of the people obeyed. They came and worked. Within weeks of Haggai's first message, the building had resumed. The practical genius of Haggai's confrontation was that it worked. The community knew what needed to be done. What it had needed was someone willing to name the gap directly, without softening it, and connect it to consequences the community was already experiencing in its daily life. But there is a kind of difficulty that practical accountability does not reach. When the foundation of the Second Temple was laid, the text records something that does not simplify easily. The people responded with sound, but the sound could not be sorted into categories. The shouting of joy and the weeping mixed together so completely that no one standing outside the circle could distinguish one from the other, because some of the people were celebrating the beginning of what was being rebuilt, and some of them, particularly the older ones who remembered the first temple, were weeping, not from despair, from the grief that lives in the distance between what you remember and what you are looking at now, between the building going in and the building that had stood here before and had meant something that no reconstruction could simply recover by reproducing the form. The weeping was honest. It was the sound of people whose joy and whose grief had become so thoroughly intertwined that they could no longer be separated from each other. And underneath the weeping was a question that Haggai's words about future glory, generous as those words were, did not entirely resolve. Whether the presence that had dwelt in the first temple was still oriented toward this ground and this people, whether the silence of the exile years had been the silence of departure, or the silence of something persisting in a form that the distance could not communicate, whether what was being rebuilt would be inhabited by the thing that had made the first worth grieving, You cannot answer that question by laying stones on a foundation. The stones answer the question of whether a structure can be raised. They do not answer the question of whether the structure will be inhabited by what made the first one irreplaceable. Haggai was not sent to speak to that question. His gifts were the gifts of confrontation and urgency, and the practical accountability that moves a community from knowing what needs to be done to actually doing it. Zechariah was sent to speak to the question underneath the building, and Zechariah did not speak in the language of practical accountability. He spoke in the language of vision, of image, of a night that lasted long enough to show a whole community the shape of what was happening in the dimensions that the work of placing stones does not reach, of a messenger who stood inside each vision and answered every question Zechariah was willing to ask. On the 24th of Shibat, 8 visions came in a single night, each one arriving with its own world, each one carrying a piece of a picture that only the whole could show. And the first vision showed a man standing very still in a low place, in the dark, among trees. The news he brought back was the last thing anyone expected to receive as grief. Zechariah looked into the night and saw a man on a red horse. He was standing in a hollow, among myrtle trees. The text places him in the low ground, in the kind of sheltered depression where moisture collects and trees grow close and dense. The myrtle is not a tree that dominates a landscape. It grows in the low places, spreading through ravines and hollows with dark leaves that hold their fragrance even after the branches have been disturbed. The scent is particular, not sweet exactly, more like something crushed and released. A fragrance that belongs to the cool and the damp, and the places below the ridgeline where the wind does not reach as easily. The text does not explain why the trees are there. Later readers have often found the setting suggestive, connecting the myrtle to branches carried in the Feast of Tabernacles, and to images of beauty that endures after a long disruption. Whether Zechariah recognized those associations as he stood in the vision among the trees is not something the text records. The setting is offered the way the night offers what it offers, without announcement or apology, and allows what it carries to accumulate in its own time. Behind the man on the red horse stood more horses, red, sorrel, and white, riders on each of them, standing still in the dark of the hollow with the quiet patience of those who have completed a long task and are waiting to report. Zechariah asked the messenger beside him what these horses were. The man standing among the myrtle trees answered before the messenger had finished turning toward the question. These are the ones the Lord has sent to go throughout the earth. The patrol had been everywhere. Every territory, every nation, every city, the community of the return would have known to name, and the vast regions beyond the edges of their world. The whole earth, covered in a single night by riders moving through the dark. And the report was ready. The whole earth remains at rest. Hold that for a moment. A community has come back from more than 2 generations of exile to find their city still in ruins. The temple is still a field of old foundations and broken stone. The walls that once marked the boundary between Jerusalem and the surrounding territory are still broken at enough points that the word boundary no longer describes what is there. The houses of people who left a generation ago and never came back are still empty or occupied by strangers. And the empires surrounding this small and underfunded community, the powers that carried out the destruction, the powers that replaced them, all of it is intact, prosperous, moving through its ordinary concerns without disturbance. The whole earth remains at rest, and instead of relief, the messenger beside Zechariah responded with something that reads like the restrained expression of a wound that has been carried a very long time without adequate acknowledgement. O Lord of hosts, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, against which you have been angry these 70 years? How long, not why. The question is not asking for an explanation of what happened or a theological accounting of the exile years. It is not a demand, but something more precise and more patient. It is the question of someone who has accepted that what happened belongs to a frame of meaning that makes sense from somewhere above the level where the suffering is experienced. But who needs to know that the suffering has a limit, that the withholding is not permanent, that what has been absent can eventually be present again. The world is at rest. The nations are prospering. and Jerusalem is still standing in its ruins, while the world has moved on to other concerns. Not fine here. Fine everywhere else. This is the specific grief the first vision names, not the grief of destruction, which had its own season and its own tears. The grief of being forgotten by a world that has healed around the wound it made in you, without noticing that the wound is still open. The quiet and particularly devastating grief of irrelevance. The empires are not paying attention anymore. They finished what they came to do, and they left. The world is at rest in the specific way that indifference is at rest. And then the Lord answered, I have returned to Jerusalem with compassion. My house will be built in it. A measuring line will be stretched over Jerusalem again. My cities will overflow with prosperity. And the Lord will again comfort Zion, and again choose Jerusalem. Again, that word carries the whole weight of the answer. Not a new arrangement that starts fresh from a neutral position. A returning. The choosing is happening again. The same orientation that was present before the exile is present now. The warmth that the community feared had permanently withdrawn is confirmed as returned. But read the answer carefully. It does not explain the 70 years. It does not offer a theological accounting of why the silence lasted as long as it lasted, or what the silence was meant to accomplish. It does not address the deeper question under the deeper question. The one the community could not ask directly, because asking it directly would have made it too real. What it does is turn the orientation. I have returned. The cities will overflow. The choosing is happening again. The world is at rest, and Jerusalem is in ruins. That is the condition on the ground. The first vision shows what is happening at the level that the patrol horses move through in a single night. And what is happening there is not abandonment, not indifference, not the settled silence of a presence that has moved on. The how long was heard, and the answer came, not as a timetable, as a reorientation. The direction has turned. Let the word again rest in you for a moment before the second vision begins. Not as a claim requiring your assent, as the shape of what the first vision was given to establish. The story is not over. The direction has not reversed permanently. The presence has returned to Jerusalem with compassion. The man among the myrtle trees is still standing in the hollow, in the dark. The riders are behind him. The report has been delivered. The lament has been heard. The answer has been given. 7 more visions remain in this night. Each one will add something to the picture that this one could not carry alone. But this one had to come first, because a community that does not know whether the story is over cannot hear what the remaining visions have to say. The prior question has been answered. The second vision is already beginning. Brevity is its own kind of language. Some things are said most powerfully in the fewest possible words. And the second vision of Zechariah's night understands this with a precision that longer passages cannot always manage. A handful of verses in the received text, brief enough to pass through in less than a minute, and if you let the brevity invite you to read quickly, as brief passages often do, treating the small passage as a bridge between the more substantial visions on either side of it, you can miss entirely what the shortness is doing. The shortness is not a limitation. It is the form the vision takes because the form fits the content perfectly. What this vision needs to say does not require length, and any attempt to extend it beyond what it is would reduce rather than add to what it carries. Zechariah lifted his eyes and saw 4 horns. In the symbolic vocabulary of this tradition, the horn is not primarily an animal image. It is a power image, the concentrated force at the front of a large animal, the thing it uses to scatter and drive and displace. When the prophetic and historical literature of Israel speaks of horns, it is speaking about the directed power of a nation or an empire, the specific capacity that allows it to push other peoples out of their places and hold the cleared space for itself. 4 of them, and the messenger beside Zechariah named them in the plainest possible terms. These are the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. That was all. Not which empires. Not the names of the kings, or the particular campaigns, or the sequence in which the dispersals accumulated over the decades. Just the effect. Named plainly, the powers that did the scattering. And everyone in the community that first heard these visions from Zechariah already knew exactly what that effect looked like from the inside. They were living in its aftermath. The returned community in a broken city was the scattered, still in the process of reassembling themselves in the ruins of what had been taken apart. Then 4 craftsmen appeared. Zechariah asked what they had come to do. These have come to terrify and cast down the horns of the nations that lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter it. 4 horns, 4 craftsmen, a response to each. Now hold what the text withholds. Because the withholding is as deliberate as anything it says. The craftsmen are not identified. The text does not name them, or explain what form they take, or clarify their relationship to the authority behind their sending. It does not describe the mechanism by which the casting down will occur. It does not provide a timeline or a sequence. It does not say what the answering will look like from the outside when it happens, or how long it will take before the community standing in the ruins can see any evidence of it. The vision gives you the fact of the response, and leaves the machinery of it unshown. This is not carelessness. In the literature of this tradition, the deliberate withholding of certain kinds of explanatory information is a recognizable choice. Some things are given as facts rather than as processes. The vision trusts the hearer with the most essential piece, which is not how the horns will be answered, but that they will be. Not the mechanism of the justice, but the existence of it. Think about what this vision needed to do for the community receiving it. They knew the scattering. They were living in the accumulated consequences of it. The powers that had displaced them were still the dominant forces in the world they were rebuilding inside of. Persia now governed the entire region, including the ground they were standing on. The community was small and underfunded, and working against active opposition from the surrounding peoples who did not want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. And the history of being scattered had not happened once. It had accumulated over generations, under different names, with different faces, each wave of it adding its own weight to what the returned community was now trying to carry forward into a rebuilt future. The second vision does not offer the community power over those forces. It does not give them an army, or a political advantage, or a change in the material conditions of the situation. It gives them the picture. The powers that scattered are themselves inside a frame that is larger than they are. The horns are visible from outside the community's moment, in a way they cannot be visible from inside it. The craftsmen have been sent. The scattering has not gone unobserved, and the observation has not gone unanswered. That is what the vision gives. Not the resolution, but the knowledge that the resolution exists and is in motion. Not the restoration, but the assurance that the forces which prevented it are already being met by something they did not anticipate. You do not always need to know who the craftsmen are. Sometimes, what you need to know is that they were sent, that the thing which broke your world has been seen by something larger than itself, that there is an answer in motion even when you cannot yet see its shape. In the reading of the 8 visions as a structured whole, many careful readers understand the second vision as paired with the 7th. Both address the removal of something hostile to the community. The second, dealing with external forces that scattered from the outside. The 7th, dealing with what was carried back from exile on the inside. What the second establishes is that the outer threat is not the final word on the community's situation. What the 7th will complete is the inner clearing that makes the outer answer fully meaningful. But that is still ahead. The second vision is brief, because the thing it has to say is brief. The horns scattered. The craftsmen were sent. The scattering will be met. Some facts are most powerful when they are not explained, or extended, or made into the occasion for elaboration. They are given and trusted to hold their own weight. Not every promise needs to explain itself to be real. The night has more to show. The third vision is already moving. And it begins not with a question about the forces that scattered the community, but with a gesture toward what the community is being rebuilt toward. Not what was done to Jerusalem, but what Jerusalem is going to become. A young man with a measuring line is walking in the direction of the city. When something has been taken, the first movement toward rebuilding almost always involves the same gesture. You try to find out what remains, not because the finding restores anything, but because the uncertainty of not knowing the extent of the loss carries its own particular weight. Separate from the weight of the loss itself, you can work with a known number. You can plan around a measured extent. You can organize a task whose dimensions are clear in ways you cannot organize a task whose dimensions are still uncertain. Converting the uncertainty into something specific and countable is the first step toward being able to move. Not recovery itself, the precondition of recovery. The community that had returned to Jerusalem understood this instinct from the inside. They had come back to a city whose walls were broken and whose center was gone. The natural and entirely reasonable response was to find out what was left, to walk the perimeter, to stretch a line from one end to the other and arrive at numbers that could be worked with. A city whose dimensions you know is a city whose rebuilding you can plan. A city whose perimeter you can trace is a city you can begin to think about defending again, about filling again, about making into something that functions as a city rather than as the remnant of one. That is what the young man in the third vision was doing. Zechariah looked up and saw him, a man with a measuring line in his hand, walking with the purposefulness of someone who knows what task he has been given and is getting on with it. And when Zechariah asked where he was going, the answer was simple and direct and entirely reasonable. To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide it is and how long, the first step of any honest accounting. You cannot build walls without knowing where to run them. You cannot plan the layout of a city without understanding its current dimensions. The young man with the measuring line was doing what anyone standing before a ruined thing ought to do before attempting to rebuild it. He was trying to find out what he was working with, and then the messenger beside Zechariah moved. And what was said to the young man changed the entire meaning of the walk he was taking. Run. Tell that young man this. Jerusalem will be inhabited as villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. For I will be to her a wall of fire all around, declares the Lord, and I will be the glory in her midst. Read that in the order it arrives. The first part is not a theological statement. It is a logistical observation about the future. The measuring line has been sent to measure. The city that is coming will not fit inside walls. The life flowing back into this place, the people, and the abundance of the restored community will exceed any perimeter a surveyor could draw around it. Not because walls are wrong in principle, but because the walls would be inadequate before they were finished. The city that the young man is walking toward is going to be larger than any line can contain. The measuring line is not wrong about its purpose. It is wrong about its premise. It assumes a future that fits inside ordinary dimensions. The future being described does not. Then the second part of the message arrives, and it changes what the young man thought he was measuring. A wall of fire. In the ancient world, walls were not architectural preferences or aesthetic choices. They were the definition of the difference between defended and exposed. A city without walls was a city that could be taken, that had no reliable boundary between the life inside and the forces that might threaten it from outside. Every person living inside a walled city carried in their daily life the specific security of knowing that the protection was physical and visible and provable, something you could point to, something that had a width and a height and a location that could be walked along and inspected. What the vision puts in place of that physical form is something that has none of those measurable qualities. Not stone, fire, not a fixed perimeter that opposing forces could locate and study and eventually find a way around. A surrounding presence that moves the way fire moves, that responds the way fire responds, that adjusts to what approaches it, rather than holding a static position that can be found and exploited. The protection the vision describes is not absent because it is not visible. It is present in a form that changes what protection means from the ground up, and not only the fire on the outside, the glory in her midst, the divine presence, the choosing and the dwelling that the temple had been built to receive and house, was being described not as something that would return to a rebuilt structure when construction was finally complete, as something already present in the center of the living community itself, not located in one room in one building that could again be brought down, present in the midst of the people. This changes what the measuring line is for. The young man was walking toward Jerusalem to find out its width and its length, so that the work of rebuilding could proceed from an honest accounting of what was there. He was asking the practical question that people standing in front of ruined things ask before they begin to rebuild them. How big is this? What are the dimensions of what I am working with? The vision interrupts the measurement, not to say the question was wrong, but to say the dimensions are not the answer to the question he was actually carrying. He thought he was asking a logistical question. He was asking whether the future was possible, and that question cannot be answered with a line, because the future being described does not fit inside any perimeter that could be drawn around it. You cannot measure a wall of fire. You can only live inside it. Sit with that for a moment, before the next vision begins. The young man with the measuring line was doing the sensible and practical thing. The vision does not fault him for it. It interrupts him before he can finish, because the thing he is trying to measure is not the thing that is going to protect the city. And knowing the dimensions of a ruin would give him information without giving him what he most needed. What he most needed was to know that the future was larger than the ruins made it look. That is what the third vision gives. Not a smaller city than the one that was destroyed. A city so full of life that no wall could contain it. Not a city with better defenses than the broken walls left behind. A city surrounded by something that no surveyor has the tools to measure, and no opposing force has the means to scale. The measuring line rests on the ground. The fourth vision is already beginning. And it takes place not in a hollow among trees or in the open air of a broken city, but in a courtroom, in the space where the most consequential proceedings happen, conducted by the authority that no earthly court can approximate. A man is standing there in clothes that should not be on his body in that space. And what is about to happen to those clothes is something no human legal proceeding in all of history has ever had the standing to do. Something runs through all 8 visions of Zechariah's night that does not announce itself and is therefore easy to pass over. It is not contained in any single vision. It is distributed across all of them. Present at the opening of the night, and present again each time the images shift and a new scene presents itself. Consistent and quiet. From the first horse in the hollow to the last chariot between the bronze mountains. Zechariah kept asking what he was looking at, not once. As a single admission of uncertainty before understanding settled in, and the questions stopped, over and over, vision after vision. The same pattern. En image arrive. Something is seen, and before carrying the image forward as a thing understood and filed, Zechariah turns to the messenger beside him and asks, "What is this? What are these? What do they mean?" In the prophetic literature that surrounds this text, this is unusual enough to stop at. The earlier prophetic figures generally receive their visions and carry them without this kind of sustained dialogue. Isaiah stands in the throne room, and the seraphim move, and the coal touches his lips, and the charge is given, and the whole encounter has the quality of something arriving whole, requiring reception rather than interrogation. Ezekiel is carried to extraordinary places and sees extraordinary things, and his response is the posture of someone being addressed, not the posture of someone managing a conversation. The word that comes to Jeremiah arrives as word, with its own internal clarity, not as images requiring a separate interpreter to decode them. Zechariah asks every time, and the messenger answers every time, without any indication that patience is thinning or that Zechariah ought to have understood this particular image without assistance. Read the questions carefully, and something becomes visible that a quick reading misses. Zechariah is not asking because he understands nothing. He is asking because he understands enough to know how much the image alone does not show. He can see that the horses among the myrtle trees are significant, without being able to see from the image alone what the significance is. He can see that the craftsmen have come with a purpose, without knowing what the purpose is. He understands enough to know the difference between seeing a thing and understanding it. And he will not close that gap prematurely by settling for the first interpretation that feels sufficient. He understands enough to ask the right question. That is harder than it sounds. In any situation where images arrive faster than understanding can follow, the temptation is to close the question early, to take the first meaning that presents itself as plausible and hold it, even when it is not quite right. Because the alternative is staying in the uncertainty long enough for something better to arrive. The closing early feels like competence. The staying open feels like exposure. Most people choose the feeling of competence, even when it costs them accuracy. Zechariah stays open, every time, through the whole of the night. Think about what the night must have felt like from inside it. 8 visions arriving in sequence. each one complete in itself. Each one also part of something larger that could only be seen from outside, all 8 together, which Zechariah did not yet have. He was inside the sequence as it unfolded, moving forward through the dark without any view of the shape the sequence was making. He had only the image currently in front of him, and beside him, the messenger. And the question, "What is this?" And the messenger answered. Each time, the messenger is not incidental to the 8 visions. He is built into the structure of how they work. He is the space between the image and its meaning, where a human being can live for a moment before having to carry the whole thing forward. Not an addition that could have been left out if Zechariah had been sufficiently perceptive. A necessary part of how this kind of vision transmits what it came to transmit. Some things cannot be given directly. They arrive in layers. The image contains the meaning, but the meaning is folded into the image in a way that requires the asking to unfold it. The question is the door. The messenger is what waits on the other side of it. And here is the thing worth sitting with before the 5th vision begins. Zechariah did not find the asking shameful. He did not apologize for needing the explanation. He did not treat the need for the explanation as evidence that he was not up to what the night was asking of him. He asked, and he received the explanation, and he moved forward, and he asked again when the next image required it. This is its own kind of instruction, not about visions, about what it means to be present to something larger than your current capacity to understand it, about staying in the difficulty rather than retreating from it, about asking rather than performing the confidence of already knowing. The 5th vision is about to begin, and it is the only one in the whole sequence of 8 that is given its own threshold. The messenger woke Zechariah before it opened, as if what is about to be shown requires a particular quality of wakefulness that the ordinary movement between visions cannot provide. Stay in the asking. The most important images of the night are just ahead. The 4th vision takes place in a courtroom, not the kind with a gallery and observers and a clerk recording the proceedings. The kind that exists in the imagination of this tradition as the space where the most consequential things are weighed. The heavenly court, the council before which the things that cannot be resolved in any ordinary venue are brought and adjudicated. The place where the verdicts that no human authority has the standing to render are rendered by the one whose standing extends further than any claim any human institution can make. Zechariah looked and saw Joshua standing there. Joshua the high priest, the man who stood alongside Zerubbabel as the 2 figures through whose hands the entire project of return and rebuilding had to pass. In this tradition, the high priest was not simply a religious administrator in the modern sense of that category. He was the representative of the community before the presence that the community understood itself to be in relationship with. He carried the people before the divine, the way an advocate carries a client before a tribunal. His standing was their standing. His condition in the sacred space was their condition. What happened to him in the holiest places was understood to happen to them. He was standing before the angel of the Lord in clothes that were filthy, not worn, not in need of laundering after ordinary use. The word the text uses is the strongest available in this context, pointing to a contamination of the kind that in the ritual vocabulary of this tradition disqualified a person from the very functions that defined Joshua's reason for being in that space. The high priest, standing in the most sacred of places, before the most consequential of proceedings, in the clothing of someone who should not be in any sacred space, and standing at his right hand was the adversary, Hasatan, the accuser. In the legal imagination of this text, the right-hand position belongs to the one who brings charges in a proceeding, the one whose function is to point to the evidence and name what the evidence means. This figure is not the Satan of later theological development, the personified cosmic opponent, familiar from centuries of subsequent tradition. Here the function is specific and procedural. The prosecuting counsel in a heavenly tribunal, whose role is to present the case against the defendant, clearly and without softening, and the adversary had a case. The filthy clothes were not a costume or a symbol chosen for dramatic effect. They represented something historically true about the condition of the community that Joshua stood for. More than 2 generations lived away from the land and the temple and the entire system of practice that was supposed to maintain the community in right relationship with the presence at the center of their life. The contamination was real. The adversary was not fabricating. The charges being brought were accurate. The condition of the clothes matched the condition of the record. And the Lord said to the adversary, "The Lord rebuke you." Not a counter-argument. No examination of the evidence and discovery of flaws. No dispute that the clothes are dirty or that the history they represent unfolded as it did. The adversary is not told the charges are false. The rebuking is something different from refutation entirely. It is the redirection of a proceeding by the one who has authority over the proceeding itself. The one who can say not that the evidence is wrong, but that the evidence, even where accurate, does not govern what happens next. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? A brand pulled from a fire is still a burned thing. The pulling does not undo the burning. The char is still there. The marks of what it came through are still visible in the wood. What has changed is not the thing itself, but its situation. It was being consumed. The consuming has been interrupted. The thing that was in the process of being lost has been drawn back from the threshold of loss. This is the frame placed around Joshua before anything else happens in the vision. And through Joshua, around the community he represents. Not that the damage is denied. Not that the history is revised into something cleaner than it was. Not that the charges are dismissed on the grounds that they are inaccurate. But that what you are looking at is something pulled from a fire. And what you do with something pulled from a fire is not what you do with something that was never near one. Then the Lord said to those standing before him, "Remove his filthy clothes." And to Joshua, "I have taken away your iniquity from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And they set a clean turban on his head. Read that sequence again. Slowly, not as a transaction to be processed and moved past, as an action being performed, step by step, in a specific place, by specific hands, with the angel of the Lord standing present through every step of it. The clothes are taken off. The iniquity they represent is named as removed. New vestments are put on. The turban, the specific head covering of the high priest in the performance of his office, is placed on his head clean, not ritually clean in the technical sense of having passed through the prescribed ceremonies, clean in the sense that belongs to something that has come through a process and arrived on the other side of it different from what it was. The adversary presented a case that was accurate about the condition. The vision's answer to the accurate case was not an argument. It was a change of clothes. This is what no earthly court has ever had the authority to do. An earthly court can weigh evidence and render a verdict consistent with what the evidence supports. It cannot take the contamination off and replace it with something else. It cannot reach past the logic of what the evidence points toward and do something different with that logic. The heavenly court in the fourth vision does exactly that. Not by ignoring what the adversary presented, by having an authority that the adversary's case does not circumscribe. An authority that can say, "The evidence is what it is, and I am doing this anyway." Now, hold the position of this vision within the whole of the night. In the reading of the 8 visions, as a structured and designed sequence, the 4th and 5th sit at the center. They are the hinge, the point around which everything else in the 8 visions turns. The first 3 establish the situation from outside looking in. The lament of how long. The craftsmen sent to answer the scattering. The city too full for walls. The last 3 will work from inside, looking out. The community's integrity enforced. The corruption carried away. The final patrol complete. But the movements on both sides of the center are made possible by what happens here. In the middle of the night, in this courtroom, the representative stands in filthy clothes. The case against him is presented, and it is not wrong. And the answer is not a verdict. It is a removal, a replacement, a clean turban placed on the head of someone who had no standing. By the logic of the evidence, to be wearing one, the 4th vision had to come before the 5th can mean what it means. The high priest had to receive clean vestments before he could be shown as the olive tree whose rooting supplies the lampstand. The standing had to be restored before the function could resume. You cannot carry oil to a lamp you have been disqualified from approaching. And when the angel of the Lord speaks to Joshua after the vestments have been placed, the word is worth holding. If you walk in my ways and keep my charge, I will give you the right of access among those who are standing here. The right of access. Among the figures of the heavenly court whose standing there is native, given to Joshua after the vestments, not before them, offered as the invitation to live up to what has already been extended. The access came before the conditions. Let the clean turbans settle into the quiet around you. The filthy clothes on the floor of the heavenly court. The adversary who was rebuked before the case was complete. The brand pulled from the fire, still showing the marks of what it came through. Standing in the space it was made to stand. The fifth vision is beginning. The messenger woke Zechariah for it specifically. Whatever is about to be shown required its own threshold. The messenger woke him. Among all 8 visions in this single night, this is the only one given its own moment of entry. The others arrive in sequence, one opening into the next, in the continuous unfolding of the dark hours. But before the fifth vision begins, the text says, the messenger roused Zechariah the way a man is wakened from sleep, brought him back to the threshold, set him there, on the edge between absorption and full attention. Before the image appeared, the fifth vision is the only one given that kind of preparation. And then he saw a lampstand, all of gold, a single central shaft rising to a bowl at the top, with 7 lamps resting on it, each lamp with 7 lips for the flame, and beside it, one to the right and one to the left. 2 olive trees, for anyone shaped by the tradition Zechariah was speaking from. This image arrived with immediate and specific weight. The lampstand, the menorah, was one of the central objects of the temple's holy place. Bound up with the ordered worship of the presence the temple was built to receive. It stood before the innermost curtain, and its 7 flames burned continuously. Not decoratively, the lampstand was functional in the most essential sense. Its light belonging to the life of the holy place, in a way that the destruction of the temple had extinguished, along with everything else. When the temple stood, the lampstand burned. When the city was broken and the people carried away, the lampstand went dark. Zechariah had just watched. In the fourth vision, Joshua the high priest, dressed in clean vestments, the priestly line restored to its standing in the space where the most consequential things are weighed. And now he was looking at the lampstand, the object the priestly line was appointed to tend, the light the priestly line was responsible for maintaining. He asked the messenger what these were, and the messenger responded with a question of its own. Do you not know what these are? Not impatience, not a withholding of what Zechariah needed, something closer to genuine curiosity about whether Zechariah, formed as he was in this tradition, had not already seen it. The question of someone who looked at the image and expected it to be legible to the person standing in front of it, who expected the connection between the lampstand and everything the lampstand represented to be something Zechariah could feel without needing to be told. Zechariah said he did not know, and the messenger gave the word that has traveled furthest from the context of this night and this city and this community. The line that has found its way into more conversations and more moments of difficulty and more attempts to say something true about the relationship between effort and outcome than almost anything else in the 12 chapters of Zechariah. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. That line is the answer to the lampstand. Read it in that context, and it arrives differently than it arrives in isolation, detached from the image that produced it. This is not a general principle about the superiority of spiritual means over practical ones, floating free of any particular situation. It is the specific answer to a specific question about a specific object in front of a specific prophet in a specific city where a specific community is attempting something that their resources, measured honestly, do not appear adequate to accomplish. The lampstand does not need someone to carry oil to it. This is what most readings of the famous line move past, in the eagerness to arrive at the words themselves. The 2 olive trees standing on either side of the lampstand are not decorative. They are connected to it through 2 golden pipes, and through those pipes, oil flows directly from the trees to the bowl of the lampstand, continuously, without any human hand involved in the process. The flames burn, the oil flows, the light holds, and no one is standing between the source and the fire, measuring what has been delivered, and calculating how much remains. The light burns because of where the trees are rooted, not because of what anyone is carrying. Zechariah asked eventually what the 2 olive trees were. What are these 2 branches that pour out golden oil through the 2 golden pipes? These are the 2 anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth. 2 anointed ones. In this tradition, anointing designated a person for a specific sacred office. The king was anointed. The high priest was anointed. The 2 figures most naturally understood here are Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest. The political line and the priestly line, the 2 through whose hands the entire restoration had to pass. The 2 figures who were already carrying the weight of what the returned community was trying to do. And they are olive trees. Not people who carry oil to the lampstand and hope the supply holds. Not people who must generate the oil themselves from resources that can be depleted. Trees whose oil flows from rooting, from the source that feeds them, through the pipes that connect them to the light, without their having to produce what they are transmitting or manage the supply chain of what they pass along. They are simply in their place, rooted in what they are rooted in, and the light burns from that. Then the Lord spoke to Zerubbabel directly through this vision. What are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain. The great mountain, not a literal mountain, the accumulated obstacle, everything in the gap between where the community is and where it needs to be. The political resistance, the insufficient resources, the enormous distance between the broken foundations and a completed temple, the experience of working day after day towards something that the available means do not appear capable of reaching. All of it named directly, addressed as if it were a presence in the room. What are you? The vision does not pretend the mountain is smaller than it is. It does not minimize the opposition or suggest the community has been exaggerating the difficulty. It names the mountain directly and then speaks over it with an authority the mountain does not share. Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and the top stone, the final stone, the capstone that will be placed when the temple is finished, will be placed by the same hands that laid the first stone. The work that began will be finished by the ones who began it. The mountain will have become a plain by the time the last stone goes in. And when it does, the shout will not be the shout of military triumph or political victory. It will be, "Grace, grace," said twice, as if once is not enough to hold what the word is carrying. As if the thing that made the impossible possible needs to be named twice in the shout, so it is not mistaken for anything generated by the people who did the work. So it cannot be attributed to might or power or the sufficiency of available resources. Grace, grace. Now sit with what this vision was giving to the community that first received it. Zerubbabel was governing under Persian authority, with no independent standing of his own. The community was small, the resources were limited. The opposition was active. Any practical reckoning with the gap between what the project required and what was available to meet it would have produced serious doubt about whether the thing was completable. The fifth vision is the answer to that doubt, not by denying the gap, not by minimizing the mountain, by showing the source of the oil, by pointing to where the light is coming from, by saying plainly that the completion of this work does not depend on the resources the community can generate. Because the oil flowing through the golden pipes is not oil, the community is generating. The trees are rooted. The oil flows from the rooting. The light burns from the oil. And no one has to carry anything for that chain to hold. Let the image of the lampstand and the two trees settle around you. The oil flowing through the golden pipes in the dark. The seven flames holding. The words spoken over the mountain that stands between the broken foundations and the finished temple. Not by might, not by power. The sixth vision is coming. It carries something the fifth could not carry alone. The lampstand burns above a community that is required to be something specific in its daily life. In the ordinary fabric of how people deal with each other in the world below the lampstand. What the sixth vision enforces is the integrity without which the light above is a light burning over something hollow. Let your breathing slow. You are in the deepest part of the night now. The center has been given. Everything from here moves outward from it. Zechariah lifted his eyes, and it was already there. No gradual appearance from the distance. No slow emergence from the dark at the edge of vision. He looked up and the scroll was in the sky above him. Already present. Already in motion. Already filling the air with a scale that made the ordinary measurements of things feel momentarily uncertain. A scroll. Open. Flying. The text gives the dimensions with unusual precision. 20 cubits long. 10 cubits wide. A scroll the size of a large room. Unrolled and moving through open air above the city that was still in the slow and difficult work of putting its broken stones back together. This is the curse, the messenger said, that goes out over the face of the whole land. The whole land, not a district, not a particular class of offenders that could be separated out and set apart from the rest of the community. The whole land. The same ground the measuring line had been walking toward. The same territory the wall of fire was promised to surround. The same community whose representative had just stood in the heavenly court and received clean vestments. The contrast is not accidental. The fourth vision dressed the high priest in clean garments. The sixth vision sends something over the land he represents. These two movements belong together in the same picture. The restoration of the community's representative in the heavenly court does not by itself restore the condition of the community's daily life. The clean vestments on Joshua do not automatically clean the conduct of the people he represents. The vision of the lampstand burning does not mean the lamp is burning over a community whose ordinary transactions are honest. The scroll carried two clauses. Everyone who steals will be removed, according to what is written on one side. Everyone who swears falsely by the name of the Lord will be removed, according to what is written on the other. Two violations. Not a comprehensive moral inventory covering every possible transgression. 2. The one who takes what belongs to another. The one who uses the weight of a sacred oath to carry something that is not true. Hold those two together, and something becomes visible that a hurried reading can miss. Stealing and swearing falsely are not simply two items from a longer list. They are two attacks on the specific quality of life that makes a community capable of doing the work the returned community was trying to do. In a community where theft goes unremarked, no one can rely on holding what they have. Trust in the security of shared arrangements dissolves. In a community where sacred oaths can be used to carry lies, the most serious form of language available to human beings has been corrupted at its source. Both violations dissolve the particular kind of trust that rebuilding requires. The trust of people sharing resources toward a common project that none of them can accomplish alone. The trust of making agreements and relying on each other to keep them. The returned community was trying to rebuild in exactly that environment. And the environment would be poisoned by these two things in particular. The scroll was not abstract ethical instruction drifting at a theoretical distance. It was landing in the specific conditions of a specific people, trying to do a specific thing that required the specific kinds of integrity the scroll was naming. Now the detail of what the scroll does once it has located its target. It does not deliver a warning from outside and withdraw. It enters. The scroll goes into the house of the one who steals and the house of the one who swears falsely, and it remains. It consumes the house from the inside, the timber of it and the stones of it, until nothing is standing. Not a penalty imposed by an external authority that arrives, renders judgment, and departs. The scroll enters the house and stays. The house comes apart from the inside, because the violation that is inside it is incompatible with the structural integrity of what the house is supposed to be. The undoing works from within, because the corruption was within. Many careful readers have noted the dimensions of this scroll. 20 cubits by 10 cubits. The same as the vestibule of the Temple of Solomon. The entrance hall through which one passed when moving from the ordinary world into the sacred interior. As several commentators have observed, whether this correspondence was deliberate the text does not say, but in the reading of many who have sat with it carefully, the scroll that enforces the integrity of daily life is sized to the threshold of the house the community is trying to rebuild, as if the entrance to the restored sacred space and the conduct of ordinary commercial and social life are not two separate moral territories. The floor of the temple and the dealing in the marketplace belong to the same fabric, not by might, nor by power. The fifth vision said, The sixth vision adds what the fifth could not say alone. Not by ceremony either. Not by the restoration of sacred forms without the daily integrity that gives the forms their meaning. The restoration being described across the 8 visions of this night is not partial. It does not allow a community to rebuild the sacred and leave the ordinary unreformed. Let the scroll pass over now. The 7th vision is forming in the dark ahead. The strangest image of the entire night. Something sealed in a container with a lead cover pressed down over it. 2 women with wings like a stork, lifting the whole thing into the air. And the question about where the things that corrupt a restored community are supposed to go. Most people moving through the 8 visions of Zechariah in sequence find that something changes when they arrive at this one. The strangeness in the other visions is navigable. The horses in the myrtle trees become the patrol of the whole earth. The horns and the craftsmen become the scattering met by an answer. The measuring line becomes the city too full for walls. The filthy clothes become clean vestments in a heavenly court. The lampstand becomes the word about might and power and oil flowing from trees. The flying scroll becomes the integrity required of a community in the process of being restored. Each of these visions carries its strangeness in a form that the surrounding explanation can largely account for. You can hold what you have been shown. The 7th vision is different. Not because the explanation fails. The messenger explains it. And the explanation is clear on its own terms. But something in the image itself exceeds what the explanation can fully contain. The way certain experiences exceed the words available for them without those words being wrong. You can say exactly what happened. The saying does not entirely dissolve what the having happened leaves in you. Zechariah lifted his eyes and saw a basket going out, not a carrying basket. An ephah. The standard unit of dry measure in the economy of this community. The container used to measure grain in transactions and storehouses, and the ordinary quantification of goods moving between people trying to sustain their daily lives. Something associated with commerce. With the normal exchange that takes place between people in a functioning community. The most ordinary of objects. What is this? Zechariah asked. This is their iniquity in all the land. The messenger said. The iniquity of the whole land, contained in the measuring vessel of daily exchange, as if the moral condition of the community had been gathered into the object most associated with its ordinary transactions, as if the corruption was not separate from the economy of daily life, but had been sitting inside it all along, measured out daily alongside everything else, a part of the ordinary business of the community that no one had named as such. Then a lead cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting inside the basket. This is wickedness, the messenger said, and he thrust her back into the basket and pressed the heavy lead cover down over the opening. Then 2 women appeared with the wind in their wings. Wings, like the wings of a stork. They lifted the basket between them and carried it upward into the air. Moving toward a destination Zechariah could not yet see. Where are they taking it? Zechariah asked. To build a house for it in the land of Shinar. The messenger said, and when the house is ready, it will be set down there on its own base. Shinar, the name in this tradition for Babylon, the place the community had returned from, the territory of the exile, the land that represented, in the geography of communal memory, the source and the setting of the long absence. Whatever the basket contains is being returned to where it came from, not destroyed, not eliminated from existence. Given a fixed address in the place of its origin, housed there, set on its own base, permanent in the land where it belongs, rather than wandering as a contamination in the land where it does not. Now the question that honest engagement with this vision cannot avoid. Why is wickedness represented as a woman? This is not a small question, and it deserves a real answer, rather than a quick reassurance. The first thing worth knowing is that in biblical Hebrew, many abstract nouns carry grammatical feminine gender. This is a feature of the language itself, not a theological or moral statement about women or femininity. Wisdom is grammatically feminine in Hebrew. The city of Jerusalem is addressed with feminine pronouns throughout the prophetic literature. Folly is feminine. The word used here for wickedness, Risha, is a grammatically feminine noun. When a writer working in Hebrew personified a grammatically feminine abstract noun in a vision as a female figure, They were following the internal logic of the language they were working in, rather than making a claim about women. That context matters and is necessary. Some scholars who have spent sustained time with this vision understand what the basket contains as a representation of a specific form of corruption. The returned community was being called to exile, back to its origin. Several commentators have connected the word Risha here to patterns of worship and practice absorbed during the long decades of living in Babylon. Practices that the return was meant to mark a decisive departure from. In this reading, the vision is not making a statement about women, but using the grammatical gender of a Hebrew abstract noun to personify the exile of something that had entered the community from the outside and needed to be sent back. The text does not resolve the question with complete finality. What it gives is the image and the explanation and the destination. The honest response to the question is to sit with it rather than cover it over. To offer the context without pretending the context closes everything, and to allow the vision to be what it is. A strange and powerful image that raises a real question as part of doing its work. Now hold this vision in the structure of the whole night. Many careful readers understand the seventh vision as paired with the second. The second showed the external powers that had scattered the community being met by craftsmen sent to answer them. The seventh shows something gathered from inside the community itself and carried back to the territory it came from. External threat addressed from the outside. Internal corruption addressed from the inside. Both removed. Both given a destination that is not here. The community that first heard these visions from Zechariah understood what the basket represented. They had returned from Babylon. They had spent more than 2 generations surviving in a world that ran on different terms than the tradition they were called to carry. And they had brought things back with them that were not native to who they were trying to be. Not as deliberate choices in most cases, as the natural result of long immersion in an environment, the way any environment shapes the people who live inside it long enough. The vision does not condemn them for it. It does not add the weight of guilt to the weight already being carried. It shows them the basket, the lead cover going down, the 2 women with their stork wings lifting the whole thing into the air toward Shinar, toward a house being prepared for it there, a fixed place, where what does not belong here can exist in the place where it belongs. The corruption has a home. It is not here, and the vision says it can be sent back, not by the community's effort of self-purification, not by a campaign of collective moral improvement organized and managed from the inside, but by the same kind of action that characterized the answer to the adversary's case in the 4th vision. Something comes. Something gathers what needs to go. Something carries it to where it belongs. The basket is rising. The stork wings are carrying it upward through the dark. Shinar is below the horizon, but the direction is set and does not change. 7 visions have been seen. 1 remains, and the last vision brings back the horses. The same symbolic world that opened the whole night in a hollow among myrtle trees, but the horses at the closing of the 8th vision are not the horses of the opening of the first. The colors are not identical. The report they carry back is not the same report. The meaning that arrives from the same vocabulary of patrol and return is not the same meaning, because the community's position in the picture has changed across everything the night has shown between the 1st vision and the last. The 7th vision is complete. The basket is in the air. What did not belong here is going home. Let your breathing go slower now. The night has almost finished with what it came to show. The 8th vision is just ahead. 2 mountains stood across from each other with a valley between them. The text names what they were made of. And the naming is not decorative. Bronze, not stone, which is the ordinary material of mountains and of permanence, and of the weight that geological time produces in the ground. Bronze is the material of things deliberately shaped to endure, of vessels and instruments made to hold their form across the pressures that ordinary materials yield to over time. The 2 mountains between which the 4 chariots emerged were not geographical accidents or atmospheric detail added to fill the vision. They were placed. The vision is using the language of foundational permanence, of something that simply is, that does not shift with the weather or the politics or the particular discouragements of the current season. From between them came 4 chariots. The first, pulled by red horses. The second, by black. The third, by white. The fourth, by dappled horses. Strong ones. The text says, and Zechariah asked the messenger what these were. These are the four winds of heaven, going out after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. Four winds, going to the four quarters, moving outward from between the bronze mountains after standing before the one who governs everything they were about to move through. The black horses went toward the north country. The white went after them. The dappled went toward the south. The patrol spread across the whole earth. And then the messenger spoke again without being asked. Not in answer to a question, as an announcement offered to the person who had been standing in the right place long enough to receive it. Those who go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country. My spirit, at rest, in the north. Stop there. If you have followed this night from its opening moment, you know exactly why those 6 words carry the weight they carry. The whole night began with horses in a hollow. In the first vision, riders had patrolled the whole earth and returned with their report. The world was at rest. The nations were undisturbed. The empires that had destroyed Jerusalem and carried the people into exile had moved on to their other concerns without looking back at what they had left behind. And the messenger beside Zechariah had responded to that report with the oldest and most compressed version of a wound carried too long without acknowledgement. How long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem? Because the whole earth being at rest was not peace. It was the particular stillness of a world that had finished what it came to do and moved on. The quiet of indifference, the rest of having other things to attend to. Jerusalem broken, while the world prospered around the breaking. That was the first vision. And now, at the close of the entire night. After all, 8 visions in the dark of a single February night in the highlands around Jerusalem. The horses go out one final time. The same symbolic world. Horses. Patrol. The whole earth traversed in a night. Return with a report. But the report is not the same report. The Spirit of the Lord is at rest in the north country. In the prophetic imagination of this tradition, the north was not a neutral direction on a compass. It was the direction the devastation came from. The Assyrian campaigns came from the north. The Babylonian destruction came from the north. The powers that had scattered and displaced and brought down the first temple had arrived from the north and carried the people toward the north. In the geography of communal grief that the returned community lived inside of, the north was the territory of the longest and most particular losses. The direction you faced when you were facing what had been done, and the 8th vision says the Spirit of the Lord is at rest there now. Not returned to Jerusalem and waiting at the city's edge for the temple to be completed before entering. Not present at the community's location in the way it had been present before the exile. As if the decades of absence were simply a gap to be bridged. At rest, in the north country, in the territory the losses came from, as if the presence that had seemed withdrawn has not merely returned to its previous position, but moved past it, into the direction of the deepest wound, and settled there. Hold the first vision and the 8th vision side by side. They are not the same vision told twice. They are the same symbolic vocabulary showing 2 entirely different conditions. Horses patrolling the whole earth. Return with a report of what was found. In the first, the rest of the world is grief, because Jerusalem is forgotten inside it. In the 8th, the Spirit at rest in the north is resolution, because the presence has moved into the territory that produced the forgetting. Same movement, same vocabulary, completely different meaning, because the community's position in the picture has changed across everything the night has shown in between. The lament of how long, spoken in the first vision, into the stillness of a world that had moved on, is answered in the 8th, not with a timetable, but with a location. The Spirit is at rest in the north. The presence has gone further than the community could have asked. It has not settled back at the starting point as if the exile were simply a detour. It has gone into the territory of the exile itself and come to rest there. That is what the whole night was building toward. Not a new set of facts about the external world. The world outside is largely unchanged. The city is still being rebuilt. The temple is not complete. The gap between where the community is and where it needs to be is still enormous. The great powers are still the great powers. But the orientation has changed at a level more fundamental than the facts. The presence that the first vision showed as absent from any awareness of Jerusalem has moved into the territory of Jerusalem's longest grief and come to rest there. And that changes everything about what the work of rebuilding means. The community in the cold of the Highland winter is not working in a world that has forgotten them. They are working inside a picture in which the spirit has gone north. The horses are standing still between the bronze mountains now. The final patrol is complete. The night of the 24th of Shebat has shown everything it came to show. From the lament at the opening to the settlement at the closing. From the myrtle trees and the report of a world at rest to the chariots and the report of the spirit at rest in the territory of loss. 8 visions. One night. A complete picture. Let the 8th vision settle into the dark around you. The bronze mountains. The 4 chariots going out. The spirit moving north and resting there. The night has given everything it came to give. The text does not give the year. It gives the day. The 24th day of the 11th month. The month of Shebat. In the 2nd year of Darius. Not the year alone. Which would locate the event in a broad period. Not the month alone. Which would give it a season. The day. The specific coordinate in time that allows this night to be placed in relation to other specific moments. 5 months after the work of rebuilding, the temple had been resumed under Zerubbabel. 3 months after Zechariah had first been called to speak. In the prophetic literature, dates appear when they matter, when the specific moment has relationships to other specific moments that the reader needs to hold in order to understand what is happening. The 24th of Shebat was dated not as a matter of record-keeping but as a way of saying this night had a position. It belonged to a sequence. It arrived at a particular point in the slow process of a community trying to rebuild itself from the ground up. And where it arrived in that process is part of what it means. Think about what it means that 8 visions came in a single night. Not one per month across a year. Not distributed across the seasons of the rebuilding in the proportion that understanding usually arrives. A little at a time. Each piece, waiting until the previous one has been absorbed before the next is added. 8 complete images. One night. Each one with its own messenger. Its own symbolic world. Its own weight. The whole sequence moving forward, from the horses in the hollow to the chariots between the bronze mountains. From the lament of how long to the spirit at rest in the north. The compression is part of what the 24th of Shebat is. There is a way of receiving difficult things that comes in layers. Slowly. With space between each layer for the processing to happen at the speed human beings can actually absorb at. The earlier prophetic tradition works that way. Isaiah received over decades. Jeremiah labored across the long arc of a painful ministry. The word arrived in the proportion the receiving could bear. What came to Zechariah on the 24th of Shebat was not that. 8 visions in one night is the kind of giving that does not pace itself to the speed of the receiver. It arrives at the speed it arrives. It asks the person inside it to take in what can be taken in, and trust that the rest will settle in its own time. After the night, in the mornings and evenings and ordinary hours that follow, it is the kind of giving that happens when something needs to be seen whole, when the partial view has become more misleading than no view, when the pieces, seen separately in the order they happen to present themselves, are not adding up to the picture. And the picture needs to be given all at once, even if the all at once cannot be fully held in a single sitting. The returned community had been inside the work for 5 months. They could see what was directly in front of them. The stone being placed, the person working beside them, the task of the current day. They were fully inside the work, which is exactly the condition that prevents you from seeing the shape of the work from outside it. What the work means in the larger frame. Whether the larger frame is moving in a direction worth trusting. Whether the daily experience of laying stones has a relationship to something larger than itself, or is simply labor in the cold until the building is done. The 24th of Shebat was the night one person was shown the whole picture, not a piece of it, not the piece most relevant to the discouragement of the current week, or the specific obstacle immediately in front of the community. All 8, the horses and the lament and the craftsmen and the wall of fire and the heavenly court and the lampstand and the scroll and the basket and the final patrol. All of it, in the dark of a single February night, before the sun came up on the 25th, because some things only make sense whole. A piece seen in isolation is real, but limited. The work of laying stones was real. But the work seen in the context of the whole picture is a different thing from the work seen as itself alone. The lampstand burning above the work, and the spirit moving into the north country, and the adversary rebuked before the case was finished. All of it visible in the same night. Together. Changes what the individual stones mean in a way that seeing them one at a time cannot change. The night of the 24th of Shebat was given to a community that needed the whole picture, because the pieces alone were not enough. Let the date rest in you quietly, not as historical information to be stored, as the particular quality of a night that was specific enough to be remembered exactly and important enough that the exactness has survived everything that has happened in the 2,500 years since. The 24th of Shebat, the night that showed the whole picture, from all 8 angles, so that no single angle could be mistaken for the whole. The text gives us 2 prophets working in the same city at the same time, and does so without comment. As if this were an ordinary thing. It is not an ordinary thing. The prophetic tradition of ancient Israel is largely a tradition of solitary figures, each one working in their own season, each one shaped by their particular gifts and their particular crisis and the particular need of their particular moment. The great voices of the tradition worked alone, without another comparable voice alongside them, doing the same work for the same community in the same city at roughly the same time. The second year of Darius was different. Haggai began first. His ministry opened in the 6th month of that year, late summer of 520 before the Common Era. He received 4 messages across roughly 4 months, each one precisely dated, each one carrying a specific charge for a specific moment in the unfolding of the community's situation. Zechariah started in the 8th month of the same year, 2 months into what Haggai had already begun. They overlapped. Same city, same returned community, same central urgency about the temple that needed to be rebuilt. And yet anyone who has spent real time with both books knows that reading one and then the other is not a continuous experience. It is a transition between 2 entirely different registers of speech, 2 entirely different relationships between language and the people it is trying to reach. Haggai is direct. The directness is almost bracing. He opens with a question that wastes nothing on approach. Is it time for you to live in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? He names the gap between what the community is doing and what it needs to be doing, with the clarity of someone who has looked at the situation and sees no reason to soften what he found. He connects the community's practical difficulties, the disappointing harvests, the wages that evaporate without accounting for themselves, directly to the failure to rebuild. He speaks in the language of cause and effect, of practical consequence, of action and its traceable absence. The people responded. The text records it with specificity. Zerubbabel the governor and Joshua the high priest, and all the remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord. They came and worked. Within weeks of Haggai's first message, the building had resumed. The confrontation worked because it was aimed at the right target. The community knew what needed to be done. What it needed was someone willing to name the gap between knowing and doing directly and connect it to consequences already being experienced. But resuming the work is not the same as answering the question underneath the work. When the foundation of the second temple was laid, the response of the community could not be sorted into clean categories. Joy and weeping mixed together in a sound. The text says, no one standing outside the circle could separate, because the older ones who remembered the first temple were weeping, not from despair, from the grief that lives in the distance between what you remember and what you are looking at now, between the building going in on the original foundations and the building that had stood here before, that had meant something that no reproduction of the physical form alone can simply recover. Haggai addressed this too. He gave a word about the latter glory of this house, exceeding the former, a generous word, forward-facing, offering the community an orientation towards something larger than the grief. But underneath the weeping was a question that a promise about future glory does not entirely resolve. Whether the presence that had dwelt in the first temple was still oriented toward this ground and this people in the present. not in the future. Now, in the cold of the current winter, in the 5 months of resumed building, and the stones going back on the old foundations, and the gap between where the community was and where it needed to be, still enormous. Whether what was being rebuilt would be inhabited by what made the first one worth grieving, that question is not answered by the confrontation between knowing and doing. It lives in a different place entirely. In the part of a community trying to understand whether the thing they are working toward means what they need it to mean while they are working toward it. Haggai was not sent to speak to that question. His gifts were the gifts of practical urgency and accountability. The question underneath the weeping needed a different set of gifts. Zechariah was sent with those gifts. And what Zechariah offered was not confrontation. It was the view from outside the moment. The horses in the hollow, and the lament heard and answered. The high priest in clean vestments, standing where the most consequential things are weighed. The lampstand, burning because the oil flows from a source the work of the community did not produce and cannot deplete. The Spirit moving into the North Country and settling there. These are not instructions for how to build. They are windows into what was actually happening at the level that building plans cannot reach. Not given before the work began, but to the community already in the work. Already 5 months into it. Asking underneath the doing, whether the doing meant what it needed to mean. One voice for the will that needed confronting. One voice for the imagination that needed restoring. Both were necessary. Neither alone was sufficient. And the community that heard both of them went back to their work and, in time, finished what they had started. The temple of Zerubbabel stood, not the temple of Solomon in its scale or in the weight it had carried, but it stood, and the lampstand burned inside it. A figure moves through all 8 visions of Zechariah's night without ever becoming the center of attention. He is there from the first vision to the last. Present at every one of the 8 scenes, without exception. He stands beside Zechariah throughout the whole of the night. He receives the questions and provides the explanations. When an explanation requires more than he can offer alone, he speaks to other messengers on Zechariah's behalf and carries back what they say. He is the one thread that does not change across a sequence whose images are constantly changing. The continuous presence in a night of discontinuous and varied images. The text calls him the angel who talked with me. In the original Hebrew, the phrase is the malach, hamadaber, be, the messenger speaking with me, or within me. The preposition carries both possibilities, and the scholarship that has looked carefully at the phrase has not settled on one reading to the exclusion of the other. A messenger standing outside you, beside you. Explaining what the images mean as they arrive is one thing. A messenger operating in some sense within the architecture of your own perception. Shaping how the images come, rather than only interpreting them after they have come, is something more intimate and more difficult to think about precisely. The text may hold both possibilities without resolving them. It may be saying that the line between the one who stands beside you and the one who works within you is not as stable as it would be reassuring to assume. What is clear is the function. Zechariah could not have moved through 8 visions without this figure. Not because the visions were too alarming to enter alone, though several of them had a quality that required the presence of someone steadying, but because the visions were operating in a register of meaning that requires translation in a specific and unusual sense, not from one human language to another, from the language of symbolic vision, where images carry layers of significance that the literal eye cannot decode on its own, to the language of human understanding, where meaning needs to arrive in a form that can be held and then carried back into the world that needed to hear it. The messenger was the translation. He was what made the visions usable, rather than only overwhelming. Not an addition that could have been left out if Zechariah had been more perceptive or better prepared. A necessary part of the architecture of how this particular kind of vision transmits what it came to transmit. Think about what this means for the kind of visions these were. In the earlier prophetic literature, meaning tends to arrive with the vision in a form that does not require a separate interpreter standing alongside the prophet to decode it. Isaiah stands in the throne room, and the seraphim move, and the coal touches his lips, and the charge is given, and the whole encounter has the quality of something arriving whole, with its own clarity built into it. Ezekiel is taken to extraordinary places, and the word that comes addresses him directly. The prophets in the earlier tradition tend toward reception. The images may be strange, but the meaning arrives with them. Zechariah asked questions, and the questions were not incidental. They were built into the architecture of how these visions worked. The horses among the myrtle trees needed to be asked about. The craftsmen needed to be asked about. The olive trees beside the lampstand needed to be asked about. And that question in particular produced the most traveled line in the entire book. If the question had not been asked, the answer would not have been said. The questions drew the meaning out of the images, the way a key draws open a door that was already there. Scholars who work with the literature these visions belong to have noted that the pattern of a human figure receiving visions alongside an interpreting messenger is one of the defining features of the apocalyptic genre. The tradition of texts that claim to reveal what is hidden about the structure and direction of things. This pattern distinguishes this kind of visionary literature from the earlier prophetic tradition. Scholars have proposed various reasons for the difference. Some understand it as reflecting a sense, in the communities producing this literature, that the distance between the human and the divine had become more pronounced over time, requiring more structured mediation than the earlier tradition needed. Others read the interpreting messenger as a literary feature that allows complex symbolic material to be made accessible to a wider audience without flattening its symbolic character. Both observations point to something real about what these texts are doing and why they work the way they work. What the Malak Hammadaber does, in whatever way you understand his presence, is preserve the questions in the text. Zechariah's questions are there, not edited out as signs of insufficient comprehension, not replaced by a narration in which the prophet received everything fully formed and grasped its significance without assistance. The asking is there. The genuine not knowing that preceded the understanding is there. The process of meaning arriving through dialogue rather than descending complete is there. A tradition that preserved only the visions and their content would be offering a finished product. The process of arriving at the content, the staying present through the uncertainty, the willingness to ask what you are looking at, rather than pretending to already know. None of that would be visible. By preserving the questions, the text preserves the process, and the process is a kind of teaching that no summary of the vision's content can provide. Not about how to interpret symbols, about how to be present to things that are larger than your current capacity to understand them, about staying in the not knowing long enough for something real to arrive rather than filling the gap with the first available interpretation, about asking rather than performing the confidence of already knowing, about remaining in the vision even when the vision is strange enough to make leaving feel like wisdom. Staying was the wisdom, asking was the door, question after question, explanation after explanation. One night, the Malak Hammadaber was there for every question Zechariah was willing to put into words. Through all 8 visions, from the myrtle trees to the bronze mountains, from the opening lament to the closing settlement. And then the night ended. The visions had been seen. The questions had been asked. The answers had been given. What remained was the carrying. The morning of the 25th of Shebat, and the community that needed to hear what the night of the 24th had contained. Let the messenger settle into the quiet now. He did what he came to do. The night is becoming something different, something slower and less structured and closer to the surface of sleep. What remains is the texture of the whole, the shape the 8 visions make when you can finally step back far enough to see all of them at once. And then the chapters that came after this night, where the language Zechariah carried forward found its way into moments, centuries later, that needed exactly what that language had learned to carry. The analytical part of this night is done. What comes next is softer. The city was not waiting. When the community came back from exile, they came back to a geography that had not changed. The hills were the same hills. The valleys between them ran in the same directions they had always run. The spring that had supplied water to the settlement for centuries before the displacement was still running. The sky above Jerusalem was the sky that had always been above Jerusalem. The particular quality of light in the highlands at different times of day, the way the limestone catches it in the late afternoon and holds it longer than the surrounding terrain, that had not changed, but the city was gone. Not damaged in the way that buildings are damaged when they need repair. Gone in the way that a place is gone when the people who made it what it was have been absent long enough for the place to become something else. The walls were broken at enough points that the word boundary no longer described what was there. The houses stood empty or had been occupied by people from the surrounding region who had moved into the vacancy. And the temple, the building that stood at the center of Jewish religious life and meaning in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate, had been brought down to its foundations. The rock was there. The outline of what had stood was still readable in the ground, but nothing rose above it. Think about what a community carries when it has spent more than 2 generations in a foreign land and has finally come back to find this. Not only the practical weight of rebuilding, the practical weight was real, and the community was working on it. Already 5 months into the resumed construction, by the time the 24th of Shebat arrived, the practical weight of rebuilding a city can at least be converted into tasks. You can plan it. You can divide the labor and count the resources and measure the work against the progress. What cannot be converted into a task is the theological weight of the ruins. In this tradition, the temple was not primarily a building in the architectural sense. It was a location, a specific place in the created world where what later Jewish tradition would describe as the divine dwelling, using a Hebrew root meaning abiding and remaining, had chosen to be close, not visiting, not passing through, choosing a particular ground and settling there in a way that the entire system of sacred practice, the priestly functions, the calendar of feasts, the organized life of the religious year, was oriented toward receiving and maintaining. When the temple was destroyed, the deepest question the returned community faced was not about architecture. It was about whether the settling was still happening, whether the choosing was still oriented toward this people and this ground, whether the long silence of the exile years, the silence that had persisted through decades of foreign land and foreign rule, had been the silence of a presence that had withdrawn, or the silence of something persisting in a form that the distance simply could not communicate across. You cannot answer that question by laying stones on a foundation. The stones answer the question of whether a structure can be raised. They do not answer the question of whether what the structure was built to receive will inhabit the rebuilt structure. And the community was asking that question. Not always directly, not always in words that named the question plainly, but the weeping of the older ones when the foundation went in, the weeping that mixed with the joy so completely that the two sounds could not be separated from outside the circle. That weeping was carrying the question, not grief over what the building would look like compared to the first one, grief over what might not come back with the building. Haggai had addressed this with a word about future glory, a generous and forward-facing word, a word that gave the community an orientation toward something larger than the current gap. But the question underneath the weeping was not primarily a question about the future. It was a question about the present, about whether the presence that had dwelt in the first temple was here now, in the cold of the current winter, in the gap between the broken foundations and the finished building, whether the silence of the exile years meant what the community feared it might mean. The 8 visions of Zechariah's night were given to answer that question, not by argument, by showing, by taking one person through 8 images in a single dark night and giving them a view of what was actually happening in the dimensions that the work of laying stones does not reach. The level where the patrol horses move through the whole earth in a night and return with their reports. The level where the adversary presents his case and is rebuked before it is finished. The level where the oil flows from trees that are rooted in a source the community did not create and cannot deplete. And the level where the Spirit moves into the territory of the longest losses and comes to rest there. Not one vision but 8. Not a partial view but a whole picture. Given in one night because the community inside the work needed the view from outside the work. The first vision showed that the lament of how long had been heard and the direction had turned. The fourth vision showed the community's representative receiving what the adversary's accurate case could not prevent. The fifth vision showed the source of the light flowing from something the community's effort did not generate. The eighth vision showed the presence moving into the North Country and settling there. None of this was given before the work began. The community was already in it, already placing the stones, already counting the progress and measuring the gap and enduring the opposition and carrying the weight of a task whose dimensions kept revealing themselves to be larger than the initial accounting had suggested. The 8 visions were not given to start the work. They were given to show what was happening while the work was happening. The view from outside the moment that no amount of work can generate from inside it. The ruins are what the ground level shows. The 8 visions showed what was happening above the ground level. And what was happening above the ground level was not the silence of absence. It was never the silence of absence. It was something persisting in a form the exile years could not carry across the distance. Something that had returned to Jerusalem with compassion, as the first vision said. Something that had moved past the point of return, into the territory of the longest loss, and settled there. As the 8th vision said, there is a specific kind of loss that requires this kind of response. Not the loss that can be repaired by the replacement of what was lost. The loss that raises the question of whether the thing that made the lost thing worth having is still present in the world at all. The loss that does not just take something away but makes you uncertain about whether the ground you were standing on before the loss is still there to stand on. The community returning to Jerusalem was carrying that kind of loss, and the 8 visions were given to show them that the ground was still there, not by describing it abstractly, by showing them the lampstand burning and the adversary rebuked, and the wall of fire that needs no measuring line, and the spirit at rest in the north country. The view from outside the ruins, showing what the ruins themselves could not show from the inside. Step back from the 8 visions far enough, and something becomes visible that cannot be seen from inside any single one of them. Not the sequence of 8 separate images, each one requiring its own interpretation before the next is admitted. A structure, an architecture in which the first vision and the last are in conversation with each other. The second and the 7th mirror each other. The 3rd and the 6th correspond to each other. And the 4th and the 5th carry the weight of the whole at the center. Joyce Baldwin was among those who drew attention to this reading of the 8 visions as a chiastic structure, an arrangement in which elements at the beginning and end mirror each other, while the central elements form the turning point of the whole. This way of reading has been shared by many careful readers since. And while scholars continue to discuss the details of how specific pairings work and what each one means, the observation that the 8 visions have an internal design beyond simple sequence is one that careful and sustained attention to the text tends to confirm. In this reading, the night has a shape. Hold it slowly, not to analyze it but to feel what it does. The first vision and the 8th are the outer frame. Both have horses. Both involve patrol. Both return with a report of what was found. In the first, the report is that the world is at rest while Jerusalem is forgotten, and the response is the lament of how long. In the 8th, the report is that the spirit is at rest in the north country, and the implication is that what the lament asked for has been given. Same vocabulary, same structure, completely different weight, because the community's position in the picture has changed across everything the night has shown in between. The first vision opened a question. The 8th vision answered it. The 2nd and the 7th stand across from each other in the structure. The 2nd addressed what was done to the community from outside. The scattering powers met by craftsmen sent to answer them. The 7th addressed what was carried back from exile on the inside, gathered into a container and sent to its proper home. External threat answered from outside. Internal corruption cleared from within. The community being restored is not only defended from outside forces, but emptied of what it brought back that did not belong in the restored community. The 3rd and the 6th correspond to each other across the center. The 3rd opens the city's future boundary outward to something no measuring line can contain. The wall of fire that surrounds, rather than limits. The 6th draws the community's moral boundary inward with precision. The scroll enforcing the integrity, without which the open city has no ground to stand on. The freedom of the restored community and the faithfulness of the restored community belong to the same wholeness. You cannot have one sustainably without the other. And, at the center of the structure, the 4th and the 5th, Joshua, in filthy clothes, receiving clean vestments in the heavenly court, standing in the space it was made for him to stand. and the lampstand burning, because the 2 olive trees supply oil from a source that does not depend on what the community can generate or what the community can deliver. These 2 are the hinge, the turning point, the point around which everything else in the 8 visions turns. Not by accident of placement, but by the logic of what they contain. Everything else in the structure depends on what happens here. At the center, the external threats answered in the 2nd and 7th are answered because the center is intact. The city's future opened in the 3rd is opened because the center is intact. The moral integrity enforced in the 6th is possible because the center is intact. The final patrol in the 8th finds the spirit at rest because the center is intact. The center makes the circumference possible. Now let the structure do something in you that any description of it cannot do. You have moved through all 8 visions tonight. The hollow among the myrtle trees, the craftsmen sent to answer the horns. The measuring line stopped before it could reach the far boundary of a city too full for walls. The heavenly court and the clean turban. The lampstand burning from the trees on either side of it. The scroll moving through the air over the whole land. The basket lifted toward Shinar. The final patrol and the spirit moving north to rest. All 8, in the dark, in one night. And now the shape is visible that was present in every one of them from the first, but could not be seen from inside any single one. The first vision was always moving toward the 8th, in the sense that once the 8th vision is heard, the first seems to have been oriented toward it all along. The lament of how long and the announcement of the spirit at rest in the North Country are not 2 separate moments. They are the beginning and the end of a single movement. One question and its answer, with 6 visions in between that prepared the way for the answer to arrive with the full weight it carries. In this reading, the whole night feels like a designed thing, not assembled from available materials. Shaped, intentional, each vision placed in relation to the others in a way that gives the whole a weight no individual part could carry alone. And Zechariah moved through it, asking questions, staying present to each image long enough to ask what it was, not knowing from inside the sequence what the sequence was going to look like from outside it, once all 8 had been seen. That is what it is to be inside a designed thing, while it is still unfolding. You cannot see the structure from within the sequence. You can only ask what you are looking at, and receive what the asking brings, and move forward when the next image arrives. And then, when the night is over and all 8 have been seen, you can step back and see the shape that was there from the beginning. The shape was there in the myrtle trees, but it could only be seen from the bronze mountains. Let that rest in you now, without being held tightly. The structure does not need your maintenance to remain what it is. It has been carrying itself for more than 2,500 years. Let it carry you for the rest of this night. The lampstand is burning. The oil is flowing from a source the community did not create. The spirit is at rest in the North Country. In this reading, the whole night was moving toward that from the beginning. The night visions of Zechariah end at the 6th chapter. What comes after, in the chapters running from 9 through 14, moves differently. The dates are gone. The messenger standing inside each vision to explain the images is gone. The structured sequence of a single night with its careful architecture is gone. What remains is language, compressed and dense in some places, tender and almost unbearably particular in others. Language that moves through different registers and carries a weight that the night visions established and the later chapters continue, though in their own way, with their own voice. Whether these later chapters and the earlier ones come from the same author is a question scholars have examined carefully for a long time without arriving at a settled answer. Some read all 14 chapters as the work of one person at different points in a single life and ministry. The early chapters from the period of the returned community's rebuilding, and the later chapters from a different season. Others read chapters 9 through 14 as the work of a different voice entirely, one that inherited the tradition the earlier chapters opened and carried it in its own direction, producing a second distinct layer within what we now read as a single book. Both positions are held by serious scholars. The question remains genuinely open. The language of the night visions, and the later language preserved under Zechariah's name, grew from the same world. A small community trying to rebuild in a broken city. A community asking whether the presence was still oriented toward them. A tradition that had learned to speak in images rather than propositions. In things that could be seen, rather than arguments that had to be accepted. And the images that grew from that world kept traveling long after the world that produced them had changed into something else. The 9th chapter contains the image of a king arriving in Jerusalem. Not on a war horse with the apparatus of military conquest. On a donkey, humble, coming not to impose but to speak peace to the nations. His rule extending from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. When the Gospel writers described the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem in the days before the Passion, they reached for this image. Matthew quotes the 9th chapter directly. John references it with the kind of explicit identification that signals deliberate connection. Mark and Luke carry the donkey imagery into their accounts as well. The writers of the 4 Gospels were standing at that moment in the story they were telling, and reaching for language that had already said the thing they needed said. About how this arrival was different from the arrivals of kings who come with armies. About what this kind of coming looked like when it happened. Not by might, not by power. A donkey, humble, speaking peace. The 12th chapter carries a line that arrives in the Gospel of John at one of the most specific and consequential moments in its Passion narrative. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn. John's account of the crucifixion, in its 19th chapter, identifies the moment of the spear as the fulfillment of this passage. The identification is direct and explicit. The writer of the 4th Gospel had reached for Zechariah, because Zechariah had already given the image that the moment required. The 13th chapter contains the line that Matthew and Mark both place in the mouth of Jesus on the night before the crucifixion, when he tells his disciples they will all fall away. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. The scatter of the disciples in the garden was already named. In the language of this text, long before it happened. These connections do not require you to hold any particular theological position to find them interesting. What they show is something that stands independent of any interpretive framework. The writers of the Gospels were living inside a tradition whose language had shaped them from childhood. And when they came to the moments in the story they were telling that required the deepest and most precise images available to them, they reached into that tradition and found that Zechariah had already given them language close enough to carry the moment. Not the most prominent prophetic voice for most purposes. Isaiah was far more extensively used throughout the Gospel literature. The Psalms provided more material for more moments. But at the moment of the arrival on the donkey, at the moment of the one who was pierced, at the moment of the shepherd struck and the flock scattered, it was Zechariah's language that fit. Because Zechariah had learned to speak in images, that is what the night of the 24th of Shebat had taught, or what the tradition carrying that night had learned. Not proposition, not arguments that could be accepted or rejected. Image, the myrtle trees and the hollow, the craftsmen and the horns, the measuring line stopped in its walk, the heavenly court and the clean turban, the lampstand and the flowing oil, the scroll moving over the whole land, the basket rising toward Shinar, the bronze mountains and the final patrol, everything in a form that could be seen, and the images that came from that night, and from the life lived in the aftermath of that night, survived long enough to be recognized by people who were trying to say something true about moments they were standing in and needed language no other source had already given them. Images travel in ways that arguments do not. They find the moments that need them. They arrive still carrying the weight of the context that made them, and pick up more weight from every new context that receives them. The language of the 24th of Shebat has been traveling since the morning of the 25th, and it arrived here tonight. The night is deep now, deeper than it was when the horses first appeared among the myrtle trees. Whatever the 8 visions of the 24th of Shebat have left inside you tonight is already there. Already settling into the place where things go when they have moved past the surface of attention into something that does not require conscious maintenance to continue doing what it is going to do. Let it go where it is going. The man among the myrtle trees is still standing in the hollow. The dark is still around him, and the fragrance of the low ground is still in the air, and the riders are behind him, and the whole patrol of the earth has been completed, and the lament of how long has been spoken, and the answer has been given. You do not need to hold that. It is already inside the night with you, already doing what it was always going to do. The young man with the measuring line did not finish his measurement. He was stopped before the line could reach the far boundary of a city that was going to be too full for any line to contain. The wall of fire does not need your attention to keep burning around something larger than the ruins that prompted the measurement. The adversary was rebuked before he finished making his case. The filthy clothes are somewhere on the floor of the heavenly court. The clean turban has been placed. That exchange is complete and does not need to be replayed or processed or maintained. It settled into the structure of the night the moment it was seen. The lampstand is burning. Stay with that one a moment longer than the others. Not because it needs your attention, because it needs nothing from you at all. The oil is flowing through the golden pipes, and the 7 flames are holding, and no one is standing in the space between the source and the light doing the work of the carrying. The 2 trees on either side of the lampstand are rooted in what they are rooted in, and the oil comes from that rooting, and the light comes from the oil, and the only thing required of anyone near it is to notice that the light does not go out. It does not go out. The flying scroll has moved out of sight. It has gone where it was going. The basket with its lead cover has been carried through the air toward Shinar and is no longer here. The night's clearing has happened, and what needed to leave has left. The 4 chariots are standing still between the bronze mountains. The last patrol is complete. The horses that opened the whole night in a hollow among fragrant trees went out one final time in the 8th vision and came back with the last report of the night. The Spirit of the Lord is at rest in the north country, in the territory of the longest losses, in the direction the grief came from, in the place that, for a community that had spent more than 2 generations carrying the weight of what had happened and what had been absent, represented the deepest geography of the wound. The presence is at rest there now, not returned to the point of departure and waiting at the city's edge, gone further, into the north, settling in the territory where the exile began. That is the last word of the 8 visions of the 24th of Shebat, and it is the answer to the first. How long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem? The Spirit is at rest in the north country. The question and its answer were separated by 8 visions and 1 long winter night, but they were always going to be connected. The lament was always moving toward the settlement. The how long was always going to become the Spirit at rest. Once the 8th vision is heard, the first seems to have been oriented toward it all along. Think for a moment about what Zechariah did when the night was over. We do not know the morning of the 25th of Shebat in any detail. We do not know what it felt like to come back from 8 visions in the dark of a single night and stand in the ordinary light of a February morning in a city still rising slowly from its ruins. We do not know whether the images were still vivid or had already begun the recession that things seen in the dark sometimes undergo when the light comes. We do not know how long it took between the night and the first attempt to put what had been seen into words that could be carried back to the community, waiting to hear them. What we know is that at some point these visions were put into words, that the words reached the people who needed them, that the words were remembered and eventually written down and kept, carried forward through the complicated and very human process by which some things survive the passage of enormous amounts of time and others do not. Carried across more than 2,500 years from the specific night they were given to this one. The 8 visions were given to a community standing in the ruins of everything they had built their life around, trying to find their way back into believing that the story was not over. They were given images instead of arguments, a view from outside the moment instead of a plan for the moment. 8 ways of showing what was actually happening in the dimensions that daily work and daily discouragement and the long, slow task of rebuilding do not reach. The horses went out and came back. The adversary was rebuked before he could finish. The measuring line was set down. The clean turban was placed. The lampstand burned from a source no one had to maintain. The scroll enforced what the restored community required. The basket rose toward Shinar. The Spirit moved into the north and came to rest there. All of it in one night, and the answer to the question underneath all of it. The question the community had been carrying through more than 2 generations of exile, and through the long journey home, and through 5 months of resumed building, and through the cold of the highland winter, with the gap between the build, ruins, and the finished temple still vast, was not given as a promise about the future. It was given as a picture of what was already happening. Not absence. It was never absence. Something persisting in a form the exile years could not communicate across the distance. And then, finding its way, on the 24th of Shabbat, into 8 images given to one person in one night, so they could be carried back to the people who needed to see them. The 8 visions of the 24th of Shabbat have been traveling since the morning of the 25th. Tonight, they arrived here. Whatever they leave in the place where things settle when the thinking mind finally releases is there now and will be there in the morning. You do not have to hold any of it. It does not require your maintenance. It has been carrying itself for more than 2,500 years without anyone having to hold it up. For those who receive this text devotionally, the image the 8th vision carries is this. The presence that seemed absent from the ruins was not gone when the morning came on the 25th of Shabbat. It had gone further than the ruins. It had gone north, and it was at rest there. The lampstand is burning. The oil is flowing from the trees on either side of it. No one has to carry anything. The night is holding you, and the morning will come when it comes. Sleep now.